In 1959, workers building a dike at Yanjiang in Guangninh province found wood in the ground. Not ordinary wood. Go-lim, ironwood, the hardest timber that grows in Dai Viet. Cut to lengths of 2 to 3 meters, the points sharpened, the bases capped with iron to hold them against a river's current. Driven into the riverbed in a pattern too deliberate and too precise to be anything other than what archaeologists confirmed they were. The stakes from the Bach Dang River battle of April 9th, 1288. The trap that destroyed the Yuan Mongol fleet. The mechanism that ended 30 years of invasion. They are in the National History Museum in Hanoi. Behind glass. Measured, documented, labeled. You can see them. What the label does not fully explain is what they actually were. The popular account of the Bach Dang battle holds that the Yuan fleet sailed into the river and destroyed itself on these stakes. A 2025 study analyzing the battle as a problem of military geoscience concluded that this account is incomplete in a way that changes the meaning of the battle. The primary casualties did not come from ships being pierced by stakes. They came from fire. The stakes held the fleet in place. The fire destroyed it. The stakes were not the weapon. They were the mechanism that made the weapon possible. And this was not the first time someone had understood this about that river. In 938, a Vietnamese commander named Ngo Nguyen drove stakes into the Bach Dang River and lured a southern Han fleet in at high tide. When the tide turned and the stakes rose, the fleet was held in place. Fire completed the work. Vietnamese independence from China, which the Han had governed for 1,000 years, began at the turn of a tide on that river. In 981, the Huan reproduced the mechanism on the same stretch of water against a Song dynasty force. In 1288, Tran Hung Dao did it for the 3rd time. The same river, the same ironwood, the same tide. 3 commanders, 3 different enemies, 3.5 centuries separating the first from the last. What follows is the story of why the 3rd time worked, and what it required beyond the stakes and the tide, and why the battle that is remembered as the defining moment of the campaign was actually the product of decisions made months before April 9th. If that is the kind of history this channel finds for you, subscribe now. We go underneath the story everyone already tells. What comes next is stranger and more consequential than the version most people have heard. Now consider the board as it actually stood in late 1287. The Yuan dynasty under Kublai Khan had absorbed the southern Song in 1279 and turned its attention to the territories that had not yet submitted. Dai Viet had defeated the second Mongol invasion in 1285, producing the documented humiliation of Togun's retreat and Kublai's exile of his own son. Kublai responded the way every account predicted. He began preparing a 3rd invasion before the year was out. The 3rd invasion was different from the 2nd in one specific way that mattered. Kublai had understood what the 1285 campaign had failed to understand, that an army without food cannot sustain a campaign regardless of its tactical superiority. The 3rd invasion fleet carried 700,000 chi of grain, approximately 230 million pounds, packed onto 600 warships. The supply problem that had ended the 2nd campaign would not end the 3rd. The logistics had been solved. What had not been solved was the river. The ironwood stakes in the museum in Hanoi are the physical evidence that the river could not be solved by logistics. But the stakes are only one part of what made the Bach Dang battle possible. And understanding which part requires placing 3 things on the board before the story reaches April 9th. The stakes themselves, what they were, and what they were not, and how many times the same mechanism had been used on the same stretch of water before Tran Hung Dao drove these particular pieces of ironwood into these particular depths. The commander Tran Hung Dao, assigned to intercept the UN supply fleet at Van Don, what he failed to do, what he did instead, and why the Bach Dang battle was only possible because of what happened at Van Don 3 months earlier. And the order the king gave after the battle was won, the order his commanders ignored, and why ignoring it was what the king needed in order for the order to produce its intended result. The stakes from 1288 are behind glass in Hanoi. The tide turned at 9 in the morning on April 9th. This is where the story starts. Tran Khan Du had been assigned to protect the Van Don area in July 1286. Tran Hung Dao had given him the posting specifically because the northeastern coast was the natural approach for any UN naval force coming from southern China. The assignment was not ceremonial. Van Don was where the battle for the third invasion would begin, before the army reached the mainland, at the moment when the fleet was most vulnerable and the terrain favored interception. What Tran Hung Dao understood, and what the assignment reflected, was the specific strategic insight that the third invasion had confirmed with its 600 supply ships. The UN army that entered Dai Viet was not self-sustaining. It required the supply fleet. Destroy the supply fleet, and the army, however large and however well armed, was on the same clock that the scorched earth strategy had used in 1285. An army without food cannot sustain a campaign. The size of the third invasion made this more true, not less. More soldiers, more horses, more weapons, all of them requiring more food per day. The scale that made the UN force formidable on the battlefield made it dependent on the supply chain. The supply chain was what Tran Khan Du was guarding for. In December 1287, Omar's combat fleet arrived at Van Don. Tran Khan Du attacked. He failed. The combat fleet was too strong, too large, too well protected. His forces were driven back. He was recalled to face military tribunal. He did not go immediately. This detail is confirmed in the sources, and it is the detail that changes everything that follows. Tran Khan Du delayed his return to face the tribunal. He was analyzing what he had missed. The combat fleet had passed. But the combat fleet was not the supply fleet. Zhang Wenhu's transport ships, carrying the 230 million pounds of grain that Kublai had assembled specifically to solve the supply problem that had ended the second invasion, were coming separately. Tran Khan Du waited. When Zhang Wenhu's supply fleet arrived at Van Don, he attacked the right target. The supply fleet was destroyed. Every account confirms this. The UN army that had entered Dai Viet expecting 6 months of food had no food. The logistical innovation that was supposed to make the third invasion different from the second had been eliminated at the point of delivery. Togan in Thong Long was managing an army that was starving in an occupied capital that contained nothing to eat, in a country that had burned everything before, withdrawing. Tran Khan Du was brought back to face his tribunal. He had failed his first assignment. His delayed return and the analysis he had done while delaying had destroyed the strategic foundation of the third invasion. The tribunal acknowledged both facts. He was pardoned. The Yuan army in Dai Viet was now on the same clock that the 1285 army had faced. The scorched earth provided nothing. The supply fleet was gone. Togan began withdrawing on March 5th, 1288. By March 30th, he had ordered the full retreat toward China. There is a specific thing about Tran Khan Du's decision that the sources record and that most accounts pass over. He did not simply wait and attack the weaker target. He had failed against Omar's combat fleet and knew that returning to report the failure immediately would end his command. The delay he took was the space in which he understood what the correct target had always been. Not the warships, the food. An army without food loses not at the battle, but before it. The battle that would come at Bach Dang in April was possible only because a commander in December had understood, after failing his first attempt, that the fleet he was supposed to stop was not the fleet that needed stopping. The fleet that needed stopping carried grain, not soldiers. The clock the Van Don Interception started in January 1288 was already running when Tran Hung Dao began driving the Ironwood stakes into the riverbed in March. The stake fields were being prepared for an army that was already starving. The battle on April 9th was the conclusion of a process that Tran Khan Du had started 3 months earlier by attacking the slower, heavier, less protected ships that nobody would have expected a disgraced commander awaiting tribunal to identify as the decisive target. The fleet that would carry Omar's forces home would have to navigate the Bach Dang River. Tran Hung Dao knew this. He had been preparing the Bach Dang since March. Nan Tong was not only the reigning emperor of Dai Viet. He was the younger partner in the dual emperor system the Tran dynasty had developed across 3 generations. The reigning emperor responsible for governance and military decisions, with his father Than Tong as supreme emperor, providing the institutional authority and historical memory of a dynasty that had now survived 3 Mongol invasions. The system had produced something unusual in the medieval world. A government capable of making long-horizon strategic decisions under the pressure of existential military crisis. The 1285 decision to burn Thang Long, rather than defend it, had required exactly this: the ability to absorb an immediate catastrophic loss in service of a strategic timeline that would take months to produce its result. The dual emperor system distributed the political cost of that decision across 2 authorities rather than concentrating it in one, making it possible to execute without producing the kind of internal fracture that a single ruler facing the same decision alone might have generated. By March 1288, Nan Tong had already made the decision that would complete the campaign. Not the decision about the battle, the decision about what happened after the battle. The Yuan fleet would be destroyed on the Bach Dang River. The Yuan land army would be harassed through the northern passes. Togan would retreat home, and then Dai Viet would send an embassy to the Yuan with tribute. This was the decision. Not because the tribute was genuine submission, but because it was the specific political signal that ended the cycle. A Togan who survived the 3rd defeat and returned to Kublai, carrying the report of that defeat, was more useful to Dai Viet than a dead Togan. A dead Togan produced an enraged Kublai with nothing to negotiate. A humiliated Togan, alive, carrying 3 successive defeats back to a father who had already exiled him once, produced the calculation Nan Tong needed. The cost of a 4th invasion against an enemy that had destroyed 3 successive supply fleets and won 3 successive military engagements on its own terrain was not worth the return. The tribute that Dai Viet would send was the final move in a campaign Han Tong had been designing since 1285. Military victory to produce political sustainability. The battle had to be won. The peace had to be available. The peace required Togan to survive and carry the defeat home. Nan Tong gave the order to stop the pursuit before the battle had begun. His commanders would ignore it. They would press the retreat anyway. pushing Togun's forces through the mountain passes with the specific fury of soldiers who had inscribed that on their forearms before the 1285 campaign and had been fighting continuously since. The order would be ignored, and the pursuit would be pressed, and Togun would make it home battered and depleted, and carrying everything non-Tong needed him to carry. The ignoring of the order produced exactly the result the order was designed to produce. The soldiers' fury and the king's strategy arrived at the same destination by different routes. The order to stop the pursuit was not mercy. It was the closing move of the campaign. It will matter later. File it. While the king was making this decision, Tran Hung Dao was driving ironwood stakes into the beds of 3 rivers in Quang Ninh: the Song Chan, the Ken, and the Rut, the 3 northern tributaries of the Bach Dang, through which a fleet retreating toward the sea would have to pass. He had been driving them since March. Go limb stakes at the depths the fishermen of that stretch of water had specified, deep enough that high tide covers them, shallow enough that low tide exposes them fully. A fleet sailing in at high tide sees open water. A fleet sailing in at low tide sees what the 1959 dike workers found: ironwood, 2 to 3 meters long, iron-capped bases rising from the riverbed like the teeth of something that has been waiting. He was reproducing what Ngo Quyen had done in 938 and what Le Huan had done in 981, not as tradition, as operational analysis. He had studied both battles and understood the mechanism, and was now reproducing the conditions the mechanism required. The stakes were going into the river in March. The battle was in April. The tide turned at 9. The UN withdrawal began on March 5th, 1288. Togun ordered the full retreat on March 30th. By early April, the land forces were moving north through the mountain passes toward China, and Omar's naval forces were preparing to navigate the river system back toward the sea. The third invasion that had arrived, with 230 million pounds of grain and the confidence of an empire that had learned from 2 previous failures, was now doing what the 1285 invasion had done. Withdrawing through terrain it did not control, pursued by forces that knew every channel and every bend and every hour at which every river changed. Tran Hung Dao had anticipated the withdrawal. He had designed the 1288 campaign around its inevitability rather than its prevention. The Vandon interception of Zhang Wenhu's supply fleet in January had guaranteed the withdrawal. An army without food in a country that had burned its food supplies cannot campaign indefinitely. The scorched earth that had worked in 1285 was working again in 1288, on the same timeline, against a force that had arrived with enough food for 6 months and lost it within weeks of arriving. The question was not whether the Yuan forces would withdraw. The question was whether Omar's fleet could be delivered to the Bach Dang stake fields at the specific hour when the tide would make the stakes lethal. This required managing 2 variables simultaneously across the entire river system north of Thang Long: Omar's speed through the channels and the positioning of Dai Viet forces throughout the withdrawal corridor. The 2025 geoscience analysis of the battle describes what it calls a push and pull method. If Omar moved too slowly, Dai Viet forces pressed from behind, creating pressure that accelerated the fleet forward. If he moved too fast, Dai Viet forces fell back, creating space that slowed him. The goal was not to stop Omar. The goal was to deliver him to the stake field at 9 in the morning on April 9th. Omar was not navigating blindly. He had moved through this river system during the invasion and understood that the withdrawal presented the same ambush opportunities the invasion had exploited. He sent scouts ahead. He checked the width of the river at the broad stretch near the sea. He saw no stakes because at high tide the stakes were invisible. He saw open water where the river widened, a channel that looked wide enough to maneuver in, wide enough that his fleet's strength could force through whatever resistance waited on the banks. He was not wrong about the strength of his fleet in open water. He was wrong about what the water was concealing. The night before the battle, Dai Viet units harassed the withdrawal route with the specific intensity designed to build a particular psychological state in a commander who had been under pressure for months. Not enough pressure to stop him, enough to make the wide stretch of river ahead feel like relief. The harassment was real, and it was also designed. Its purpose was not to damage the fleet, but to shape how Omar understood the wide water when he reached it. After everything he had endured through the narrow channels, the width looked like safety. The day before the battle, April 8th, a clash at Truk Dong. The research document confirms this engagement as occurring on the day before Bach Dang, its purpose to make final contact with the withdrawal column and then break off. The Dai Viet forces that had been managing Omar's pace through the withdrawal corridor made contact and withdrew. Omar moved into the wider stretch of water. He was now inside the stake field's approach. The tide was still high. The stakes were invisible. The wider channel that looked like the last step before the sea was the specific location Tran had chosen, because it was where the river would do what it had done for No Quyen in 938 and for Le Huan in 981. The fishermen of Yenjiang had told Tran when the tide turned on that stretch of water. 9 in the morning. The stakes were at the depths the fishermen had specified. The fleet was in the approach. The forces that had been managing Omar's pace through the withdrawal had delivered him to the Bach Dang stake field with the night of April 8th ahead of him and the morning of April 9th to come. The Dai Viet feigned retreat force was positioned at the mouth of the stake field. Small warships, enough to invite pursuit, not enough to threaten a fleet of Omar's size. Their purpose was the final alignment of the trap, to give Omar a target to chase into the stake field at the moment the tide was turning, so that by the time the leading ships found the stakes, the fleet was committed and reversing was no longer a practical option. Everything was in position. The stakes were driven. The fireboats were in the side channels. The stone-throwing machines with their incendiary loads were on the elevated banks. The flanking forces were hidden at the tributary mouths. The feigned retreat force was at the entrance. The tide had not yet turned. It was the evening of April 8th, 1288. Omar's fleet was at the approach to the Bach Dang stake field. The wide water ahead looked like the last step before safety. He had survived everything the withdrawal had thrown at him. The last step looked easier than everything before. The Bach Dang River. Before dawn. April 9th, 1288. The stakes are in the riverbed. The tide is high. Take this slowly. Tran has driven the Ironwood stakes into the beds of the Song Chan, the Ken, and the Rut rivers over the past month. Go Lim, the hardest timber in Dai Viet. 2 to 3 meters long, points sharpened, iron-capped bases anchoring them against the current. Driven at the depths, the fishermen of Yenjiang specified, deep enough that high tide covers them completely, shallow enough that low tide exposes them fully. A fleet sailing in at high tide sees open water. A fleet sailing in as the tide falls finds something different rising from the bottom of the river. The tide turns at 9. He has positioned the fireboats in the side channels. Ten Lua, fire arrows. Tuyen Lua, fireboats packed with straw and oil, ready to be pushed into a stationary fleet from both sides simultaneously. Stone-throwing machines on the elevated banks capable of launching incendiary loads across the width of the river. The weapons that will do the actual killing are ready. They have been ready since March. They cannot work unless the fleet is inside the stake field at the moment the tide turns. The fleet cannot be inside the stake field at that moment unless the forces managing Omar's pace through the withdrawal corridor have delivered him there. He has studied the two men who stood on this river before him. Ngo Quyen, in 938, stood on this bank waiting for a tide on this stretch of water, with stakes in this riverbed, with fire ready on these banks. The southern Han fleet had come with numbers and momentum and the confidence of an empire reaching to reclaim what it considered its territory. Ngo Quyen had waited for the tide. The fleet had sailed in at high water, found the stakes at low tide, and the fire had done the rest. Vietnamese independence from China had begun at the turning of a tide on this river. Le Hoan in 981 had waited for the same tide on the same water. A different enemy, the same mechanism, the same patience, the same hour. He is the third man to stand on this bank, waiting for this tide. He has not inherited the tradition. He has studied it. He has analyzed what Ngo Quyen did and what Le Hoan did, and why the mechanism worked, and what the conditions were that had to be present for the mechanism to function. He has reproduced those conditions on this stretch of water because the conditions are reproducible. The river is the same river. The tide turns at the same hour. The ironwood is the same ironwood. What the 1959 dike workers will find when they break ground at Yenjiang, 671 years from now, is what he has driven into the riverbed this March. What he cannot know is whether the fleet will arrive at the stake field before 9. The forces managing Omar's pace have been working through the night, pressing from behind when the fleet slows, falling back when it moves too fast, steering it toward the Bach Dang stake field at the rate the calculation requires. But the calculation involves an enemy fleet navigating with its own command decisions, its own scouts, its own assessment of the terrain. Omar has checked the width of the river at the broad stretch. He has seen no stakes. He has calculated that the wide water is the last step before safety. The wide water is the stake field. Omar is not wrong about the strength of his fleet. He is wrong about what is waiting beneath the high water. The scouts he sent ahead could not find stakes that the tide was covering. The width he calculated as advantageous is the width that will narrow when the tide falls, compressing the fleet into the channels where the stakes are driven and the fireboats are waiting. But the fleet has to be there when the tide turns. The tide turns at 9. The fleet will arrive when the forces upstream deliver it. These are two independent variables being shaped toward a single intersection by human preparation on one side and tidal mathematics on the other. Ngo Quyen waited for this intersection in 938. Le Hoan waited for it in 981. Both times it came. The fireboats are ready. The flanking forces are hidden in the tributary mouths. The feigned retreat force is at the stake field entrance, small enough to invite pursuit, large enough to give Omar something to chase. Everything that can be prepared has been prepared. The king has already decided what happens after the battle ends. Tran Khan Du's work at Van Don in January has put the UN army on the clock that all of this was designed to run out. He waits. The tide is still high. The fleet has not yet appeared at the bend. The stakes that are invisible in the high water of the Bach Dang River on the morning of April 9th, 1288, will be found 671 years from now by workers who do not yet know they are building a dike through the site of the battle that ended 30 years of Mongol invasion. The workers will find golim, 2 to 3 meters long, iron-capped bases, and they will know immediately that the wood did not arrive there by accident. The pattern is too precise. The placement is too deliberate. The mechanism is sound. He has built everything that can be built. The doctrine that produced this moment came from a night of insomnia in 1284 when he wrote that his heart ached as if cut. The stakes in the riverbed are that doctrine expressed in Ironwood. The rest belongs to the river. Now, before the tide turns, one thing more. The battle will produce a result. The result will create an opportunity that lasts exactly as long as the king's order holds the army back from pursuing Togun to annihilation. If Togun dies in the chase, Kublai has nothing to negotiate with. If Togun survives carrying 3 defeats and a destroyed army, Kublai has everything he needs to calculate that a 4th invasion costs more than Dai Viet's submission is worth. The battle is the mechanism. The king stopping the pursuit is the weapon. Both are already prepared. The tide has not yet turned. He waits. The tide turned at 9 in the morning. Omar's fleet had entered the wider stretch of the Bach Dang River before dawn, navigating by the current. Watching the banks for ambush positions, his scouts had not been able to fully locate. The wide water looked like relief after the narrow channels he had been managing for weeks. He ordered the fleet forward. The feigned retreat force at the entrance of the stake field engaged briefly and withdrew upriver, pulling the UN fleet's leading ships into the channel in pursuit. The 2025 geoscience analysis of the battle confirms the sequence with the precision of reconstruction from tidal records and archaeological site positions. At 9 in the morning, the tide reached its turning point. The water that had covered the stakes in the Songchan, the Ken, and the Rut tributaries began to recede. By 9:30, the leading ships had found them, not by shattering against them. A ship striking a submerged stake in the moment the tide begins to fall does not immediately sink. It stops. Its hull catches on the stake or its keel grounds on the shoal around it, and the ship's forward momentum ends. The ships behind continue forward. They hit the ships that have stopped. The fleet, which had been a moving column, becomes a traffic jam. A traffic jam of wooden ships, tightly packed, unable to maneuver, in a river narrowed by the falling tide, with fireboats and incendiary machines on both banks. The Dai Viet fire attack began when the leading ships were on the stakes. 10 lua from both banks. Tuyen Lua pushed into the jammed fleet from the side channels where they had been waiting since March. Stone-throwing machines, launching incendiary loads from elevated positions that the banks of that stretch of river provided. The fire spread from ship to ship, the way fire spreads through a tightly packed neighborhood of wooden houses. Each ship pressed against the next, the fire finding its path through the contact points where hulls touched. The 2025 study confirms what the source script had already analyzed correctly, and the popular account gets wrong. The primary casualties at Bach Dang came from the incendiary attack, not from stakes piercing hulls. The stakes held the fleet in place. The fire destroyed it. This is what No Qian had done in 938. The mechanism is identical across 3.5 centuries. The stakes held, the tide fell, the fire came, The flanking forces emerged from the side channels at the moment the first ships found the stakes. The feigned retreat that had drawn Omar's leading ships into the stake field reversed, the small warships turning back toward the fleet. The retreat that had looked like weakness was now a closing movement on two sides. Omar's fleet was surrounded with the stake field behind it, and Dai Viet forces on every bearing. Omar attempted to bring forces ashore. The banks were held by Dai Viet infantry positioned specifically for this contingency. Every landing attempt was driven back. The river was the only space available. The river was on fire. The battle lasted through the morning and into the afternoon. The Dai Viet Suki records more than 400 warships captured or destroyed. Omar was taken alive. His companion Liu Gui found a small boat and escaped. The UN naval force that had been the logistical backbone of the third invasion was eliminated as a military factor. A few days after the main battle, Zhang Wenhu's additional transport fleet arrived at the Bach Dang. It had survived Van Don and made its way south, unaware of what had happened on April 9th. It arrived to find not the Yuan army it had come to resupply, but the Dai Viet forces that had just destroyed the army it was meant to serve. The transport fleet was destroyed on the same stretch of river. The waters of the Bach Dang consumed both the combat fleet and the supply fleet of the third invasion within days of each other. On the land route north, Pham Ngu Lao's forces intercepted Togun's withdrawal column at Lang Son. The land component of the retreat was as costly as the river component. The third invasion was ending in both directions simultaneously. The naval arm destroyed at Bach Dang and the land arm being dismantled in the mountain passes through which it had confidently entered Dai Viet 5 months earlier. The king had already decided what happened next. The order to stop the pursuit existed before the battle was fought. The soldiers who would ignore it were not yet being asked to stop. The tide had turned at 9. By afternoon, the river that Ngo Quyen had used in 938 and Le Huan had used in 981 had produced its third result on its third enemy in 3.5 centuries. The ironwood stakes that would be found in 1959 had done what they were driven to do. Not destroy the fleet, but hold it in place long enough for the fire to finish what the tide had started. The battle at Bach Dang on April 9th, 1288 ended by the afternoon. More than 400 warships captured or destroyed. Omar taken alive. Zhang Wenhu's supply fleet destroyed on the same stretch of river days later. The Yuan naval force that Kublai had assembled at the cost of the empire's logistical resources was gone. Togun's land forces were being taken apart in the mountain passes. The third invasion was over. And then the recognition that no account of this battle has fully examined. This had happened before. In 938, Ngo Quyen stood on this river and waited for this tide, and drove these stakes. The southern Han fleet came in at high water. The tide turned. The stakes rose. The fireboats came from the banks. The fleet that had come to reimpose Chinese governance over Vietnam was destroyed on that turning of that tide. Vietnamese independence from China, which would last 4 centuries, began at the hour the fishermen of Yenjiang knew to expect, on the Bach Dang River. In 981, Le Huan reproduced the mechanism on the same stretch of water. A Song dynasty force that had come to challenge the newly independent Vietnamese state was destroyed by the same combination. Stakes, tide, fire. The state confirmed its independence the same way Ngo Quyen had confirmed it. In 1288, Tran Hung Dao drove ironwood stakes into the beds of 3 tributaries of the Bach Dang and waited for the tide at 9 in the morning. The Yuan fleet that had come as the military arm of the largest empire on earth was destroyed by the same mechanism that had worked twice before on the same river. The stakes from 1288 are in the National History Museum in Hanoi. Go limb, 2 to 3 meters, iron-capped bases, behind glass. The 2025 geoscience study has confirmed what the museum label does not fully explain. These are not weapons. They are a lock. The weapon was the tide and the fire. The lock made the weapon possible. Ngo Kuyen understood this in 938. He drove the same kind of stakes into the same river for the same reason. Le Huan understood it in 981. Tran Hung Dao understood both of them, not as tradition, not as inherited custom, but as operational analysis. He studied the 938 battle and the 981 battle and understood the mechanism. He reproduced the mechanism because the mechanism was sound, and it was sound because the river was the same river, and the tide was the same tide, and the principle that patience and terrain and the right moment are more decisive than superior force was as true in 1288 as it had been in 938. The same river, the same Ironwood, the same tide at the same hour, 3 commanders, 3 different enemies, 3.5 centuries apart. There is a specific thing about what Tran Hung Dao did that the tradition of celebrating the battle tends to obscure. He did not simply inherit the Bach Dang tactic from his predecessors. Inheritance would have produced a reproduction of the exact conditions of 938, transferred unchanged across 3.5 centuries. What he produced was an adaptation. The scale was larger. The enemy was different in specific ways, particularly in naval capability, that the 938 Southern Han fleet did not present. The false surrender deception, the push and pull management of Omar's pace, the simultaneous land assault on Togun's withdrawal route, the specific positioning of fireboats in the tributary mouths. All of this was built on top of the mechanism Ngo Kuyen had discovered and not simply copied from it. He had read the 938 battle the way the Hich Tuong Si had been written, as a practical manual, not as a historical monument. He had extracted the principle, the tide as the decisive variable, and the stakes as the mechanism that made the tide decisive, and he had applied the principle to the specific conditions of 1288. The doctrine that the Hich Tuong Si articulated in 1284 had produced this result. The stakes in the riverbed are that doctrine made physical. They are in the museum. You can see exactly what they were. You can read the dimensions. You can understand the mechanism. The river is still there. The tide still turns at 9. Omar was taken alive. He was held in Dai Viet for approximately a year. In 1289, King Nan Tong ordered him released as a diplomatic gesture toward the Yuan dynasty. The release was a signal. Dai Viet was not seeking to humiliate the Yuan beyond what the military outcomes had already produced. It was seeking the end of the cycle. The gesture was the visible half of the same calculation the king's order to stop the pursuit had addressed. Tran Hung Dao received the order to release Omar. He arranged a ship for Omar's journey home. Then he sank it. The sources record this with the specificity that distinguishes a documented event from a probable one. Omar, released by Nan Tong, was placed on a ship that Tran Hung Dao had arranged. The ship sank. Omar is presumed to have drowned. He never returned to the Yuan dynasty. The man who had commanded the naval forces of the Third Invasion, whose fleet had been destroyed by Ironwood stakes and a turning tide on the Bach Dang River, who had survived the battle and survived his captivity and been released by a king who wanted to demonstrate goodwill, was killed not in combat, but in the specific act of departure by a commander who had made a calculation the king had not authorized. what Tran Hung Dao's calculation was, the sources do not record directly. What can be reconstructed from the outcome is its logic. Omar, alive in the Yuan dynasty, was a resource for a future commander preparing a fourth invasion. Omar had navigated the approach routes. He had managed a fleet through the river system under sustained Dai Viet pressure. He understood the specific terrain that had defeated him, its channels and its banks and its tidal patterns, in the way that a commander who has operated in a landscape acquires knowledge that cannot be transmitted through maps or reports. A dead Omar was not military intelligence for the next campaign. The king had decided Togon should survive. Tran Hung Dao had decided Omar should not. Both decisions operated on the same strategic principle from different positions. Nantong needed Togon alive to carry 3 defeats to Kublai and produce the calculation that ended the invasions. Tran Hung Dao needed Omar dead because a living Omar in the Yuan dynasty was a specific kind of threat that Togon's survival was not. Togon's knowledge of Dai Viet was strategic and general. Omar's knowledge was operational and specific. He had been inside the river system. He knew what it looked like at different tides and different seasons. He knew where the channels narrowed and where they widened, and what the wide water near the sea felt like when you had been managing narrow channels for weeks. That knowledge, transmitted to the commander of a fourth invasion, could help design a naval approach that did not repeat the errors of April 9th. A dead Omar could not transmit it. The king's decision and Tran Hung Dao's decision arrived at different conclusions from the same principle. Control what survives the battle as carefully as you control the battle itself. What survives shapes what comes next. Togon surviving with his humiliation shaped the political calculation that ended the cycle. Omar surviving with his operational knowledge would have shaped the military planning of a potential fourth campaign. Togon reached the Yuan dynasty. He died 13 years after the Dai Viet campaign. The sources suggest, as the source script notes, that traces of him were reduced from the official record. The shame of 3 failed invasions was not what the Yuan dynasty wanted preserved in the chronicle that would carry its history forward. The Yuan Shi confirms Kublai exiled him to Yangzhou. The rest is largely inference from the silence that follows. A man who commanded nearly 1 million troops across 2 invasions, who was the son Kublai had sent to end the question of Dai Viet's independence, disappears from the record after the 3rd defeat. The silence in the chronicle is its own kind of record. Omar's ship sank on the way home. Togon disappeared from the official record 13 years after he crossed back into Yuan territory. The Yuan fleet from 1288 is in a museum in Hanoi. The battle had produced its results in all the directions it was designed to produce them. The chain from the Van Don Interception in January 1288 to the normalization of relations between Dai Viet and the Yuan dynasty after Kublai's death in 1294 runs through 9 specific links, and each is documented. Tran Hung Dao assigns Tran Khan Du to Van Don in July 1286. Confirmed. Tran Khan Du fails against Omar's combat fleet and delays his tribunal. Confirmed. Tran Khan Du destroys Zhang Wenhu's supply fleet at Van Don in January 1288. Confirmed. The Yuan army loses its food supply and Togon begins withdrawing on March 5th. Confirmed. Tran Hung Dao drives Ironwood stakes into 3 tributaries of the Bach Dang River through March 1288. Confirmed by the stakes themselves, found in 1959, measured, documented, displayed in the National History Museum in Hanoi. The Battle of April 9th, 1288, the tide turning at 9 in the morning, the fleet entering the stake field, the fire applied from both banks, more than 400 ships captured or destroyed, Omar taken alive, confirmed in Vietnamese and Chinese sources simultaneously. The king orders the pursuit stopped. His commanders ignore the order. Togan escapes with his army in tatters and crosses into Yuan territory, carrying 3 successive defeats. Confirmed, Tran Hongdao arranges Omar's release and sinks his ship. Omar is presumed drowned. Confirmed. Timur Khan, who succeeded Kublai in 1294, normalized relations with Dai Viet. The tribute arrangement that allowed both sides to present the outcome as acceptable produced the permanent end of the cycle of invasions. Confirmed, 9 links, each documented. The chain that began with a commander delaying his own tribunal ended with the permanent conclusion of 30 years of Mongol invasion attempts against Dai Viet. The ironwood in the museum is the physical residue of the chain's 6th link. The stakes are behind glass. The other 8 links are in the chronicles. The chain is not the story most accounts tell about Bach Dang. Most accounts tell the story of the battle, the stakes, the tide, the fire, the UN fleet burning on the river. These things happened, and they are the most vivid and the most documented, and they are not the whole story. The whole story requires understanding what Tran Khan Du did in January and why the king issued an order he expected his commanders to ignore, and why Tran Hongdao sank a ship that his own king had authorized to sail. The king's order to stop the pursuit is the element of the Bach Dang campaign that most accounts mention and most quickly pass over. The commanders ignoring it and pressing the retreat anyway is presented as the expression of justified anger. Soldiers who had endured 3 years of scorched villages and occupied capitals and dead colleagues refusing, in the moment of total victory, to let the enemy walk home. This reading is not wrong. The anger was real and documented, and the soldiers who expressed it had earned it across 3 invasions. The men who had inscribed sat that on their forearms before the 1285 campaign and had been fighting continuously since, had a specific and legitimate grievance against the army they were now pursuing through the mountain passes. Their refusal to stop was not irrational. But the king's order was not mercy. It was the final strategic move of the entire campaign. As calculated as the stakes in the riverbed, as precise in its purpose as the push and pull management of Omar's pace through the withdrawal corridor. Nan Tong had understood, before the battle was fought, that a destroyed Togun produced a different outcome than a humiliated Togun. Kublai Khan, receiving the report of 3 successive military defeats and the survival of the son he had already exiled once, could perform a calculation. The cost of a 4th invasion against an enemy that had destroyed 3 supply fleets before the main engagement and won 3 successive battles on its own terrain was a specific cost that could be weighed against a specific benefit. The benefit of Dai Viet's submission, which Kublai had been pursuing since 1268, had been available at a price all along. The price was the nominal tribute arrangement that acknowledged Yuan supremacy while preserving Dai Viet's actual independence. The tribute that Dai Viet sent to the UN after 1288 was not surrender. It was the political instrument that ended the invasions by giving Kublai a way to close the account that did not require him to acknowledge that the account had been lost. The battle had to be won decisively enough that a 4th invasion could not be rationalized. It had to leave Togun alive to carry the defeat home. It had to be followed by the tribute signal that gave Kublai a way to record the outcome as something other than the complete failure it was. Timur Khan normalized relations with Dai Viet in 1294. The cycle of invasions that had begun in 1257 and produced 3 successive military campaigns ended not because Dai Viet destroyed every Yuan soldier on its soil, but because the political calculation changed. A humiliated Togan, carrying 3 defeats home, had changed it. The tribute that acknowledged Yuan supremacy while preserving Dai Viet's independence had made the change permanent. The king who issued the order to stop the pursuit before the battle began had designed this outcome. The soldiers who ignored the order and pressed the retreat had produced the damaged, depleted, humiliated Togan that the outcome required. The king's decision and the soldiers' disobedience arrived at the same destination by different routes. The king had anticipated this, an order that his commanders would feel the moral weight of ignoring, but would ignore anyway, produced exactly the result the order was designed to produce. Togan survived. He was destroyed enough to end Kublai's calculations. He was alive enough to carry the defeat home. This is the final strategic move of the Bach Dang campaign. Not the stakes, not the tide, not the fire. The decision made before the battle about what would survive it and what that survival would produce. The doctrine that the Hich Tuongsi had articulated in 1284, written on a night when Tran Hung Dao could not sleep, when his heart ached as if cut, when his tears fell like rain, had produced every element of this chain. The scorched earth that denied the enemy its supply. The war of attrition that turned the enemy's size into its weakness. The patience to wait for the specific moment when the terrain and the timing and the enemy's own exhaustion converged. The recognition that the battle was not the end of the campaign, but the mechanism that made the peace possible. The same doctrine, studied by von Nguyen Giap 7 centuries later, produced the campaign that ended French colonialism in Indochina at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. The rivers of the Bach Dang are not the rivers of Dien Bien Phu. The principle is the same principle. Use ease to await exhaustion. Control the pace. Wait for the tide. Strike at the moment they feel most confident, when the last step looks easier than everything before it. Omar's last step looked easier than everything before it. The wide water near the sea, after weeks in the narrow channels, looked like relief. That feeling was designed. The entire apparatus of the Bach Dang trap, the push and pull management of his pace, the feigned retreat at the Stakefield entrance, the timing of the Van Don interception that put the Yuan army on the clock, that made the withdrawal inevitable, had been designed to produce that specific feeling at that specific location at that specific hour. The tide turned at 9. The stakes rose. The fire came. 3 commanders understood this about this river across 3.5 centuries. The 3rd drove these stakes into this riverbed. The stakes are in the museum. The river is still there. One question for the comments. The Bach Dang battle was the 3rd time the same mechanism worked on the same river against 3 different enemies. The principle was then studied by Giap and applied without the river. What does it mean for military doctrine that a specific tactic can be reproduced across centuries and then abstracted from its original terrain and reproduced again? Is the Bach Dang principle a product of that particular river, or is it something that can be learned and carried anywhere? Tell us what you think. We read every comment on this channel. And if you want to be here the next time a story like this surfaces from somewhere it was nearly lost, subscribe. We will not let the silence win. There is one more thing. 3 questions were asked at the beginning of this story. They have answers now, or as close as the evidence allows. The first, The battle was won because the stakes held the fleet in place at the moment the tide turned and the fire became possible. The 2025 geoscience study confirms this with the precision of reconstruction from tidal records and archaeological positions. The primary casualties came from incendiary attack after immobilization. The stakes did not destroy the fleet. They held it. The weapon was the tide and the fire. The lock made the weapon possible. The stakes are in the museum. The mechanism is confirmed. The second, the Bach Dang battle was only possible because Tran Khan Du destroyed Zhang Wenhu's supply fleet at Van Don in January 1288. The destruction of the supply fleet put the Yuan army on the same clock the scorched earth strategy had used in 1285. An army without food cannot sustain a campaign regardless of its tactical superiority. Tran Khan Du had failed his first assignment and delayed his tribunal and analyzed what he had missed and attacked the right target on his second attempt. The battle on April 9th was the conclusion of what Van Don had started in January. Without Van Don, there is no Bach Dang, because without Van Don, the Yuan army does not withdraw on March 5th, and Tran Hung Dao does not have the specific withdrawal route and the specific timeline that the stake field required. The third, the king stopped the pursuit because the battle was not designed to destroy Togan. It was designed to humiliate him precisely enough that Kublai's calculation changed. The soldiers who ignored the order and pressed the retreat produced the damaged, depleted Togan that the calculation required. The king's order and the soldiers' disobedience arrived at the same destination. Timur Khan normalized relations with Dai Viet in 1294. The tribute arrangement preserved Dai Viet's independence while acknowledging Yuan supremacy. The cycle of invasions that had begun in 1257 ended not at the Bach Dang River, but in the diplomatic exchange that the battle made possible, executed by a king who had designed the outcome before the battle was fought. The Yuan dynasty, at its maximum extent, covered more than 24 million square kilometers. It had absorbed the southern Song after 40 years of resistance. It had sent the largest seaborne invasion force the medieval world had produced against a kingdom of 3 million people, 3 times, and all 3 times the kingdom had turned the invasion on its own terrain. The third invasion carried 230 million pounds of grain, specifically to solve the supply problem that had ended the second. The supply fleet was destroyed at Van Don in January. The combat fleet was destroyed at Bach Dang in April. The land forces were ambushed in the mountain passes on the way home. The Ironwood stakes from the battle are in the National History Museum in Hanoi. They were found in 1959 during dike construction at Yanjiang, Guangnin. They are go limb, 2 to 3 meters long, iron-capped bases, driven into the riverbed at the depths the fishermen of that stretch of water specified for a trap that needed high tide to conceal it and low tide to reveal it. They are behind glass. The 2025 study tells you what they were. Not a weapon. A lock. The weapon was the tide. The tide turned at 9 in the morning on April 9th, 1288, as it had turned at some equivalent hour on the morning Ngo Qian waited for it in 938, as it had turned when Le Huan waited for it in 981. The same river. The same mechanism. 3 different enemies across 3.5 centuries. In 1959, workers building a dike at Yanjiang found ironwood in the ground. Go limb, 2 to 3 meters long, iron-capped bases, driven into the riverbed 671 years earlier by a commander who had studied the 2 commanders who had done the same thing before him, and understood not just that they had done it, but why it had worked. and what conditions needed to be reproduced for it to work again. The stakes are in a museum in Hanoi. The river is still there. Ngo Quyen used the stakes in 938. Le Huan used the same river in 981. Tran Hung Dao reproduced both in 1288. The stakes are in a museum in Hanoi. The tide still turns at the same hour.